Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're based at the moment. Welcome to today's event on intersectional human rights frameworks, looking at the intersection of LGBTI and disability. This event is being brought to you today by ILGA World, ILGA Oceania, OII Europe, CREA, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and Permanent Missions of Mexico and New Zealand. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, specialists, and grassroots level activists who will explore this theme of intersectionality in the context of disability and LGBTI populations today. My name is Niluka Gunawardana. I will be your moderator for the day. I am a disability scholar and activist based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Before we go into the core content of the event, I want to just highlight the specific accessibility features that we have in place today. So we have voice interpretation in English and Spanish. We have international sign language. We have captioning in English and Spanish. I want to just now bring your attention to some of the settings that you need to have in place in order to follow this event. Select your language of preference. I would like to encourage all of you to click the interpretation icon. So that is the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once you click on the globe icon, please click on the language that you would like to hear. Once you have selected the language, then please click on that globe icon again and select the mute original audio from the same menu. So now you will be able to follow this event in your chosen language of either English or Spanish. If you are using the captioning, to turn on the English captions, click the closed captions in the controls at the top of the screen. You will then start seeing captioning on the bottom of your screen. If you need to adjust the caption size, you just have to click on the arrow next to the start the video icon and choose video settings. There you can click on accessibility and move the slider to adjust the captioning size. For those of you who need captioning in Spanish, there is now a link that has been put in the chat box. Please copy and paste that link to follow the closed captioning in Spanish. As I mentioned before, international sign language interpretation is provided for this event. If you want to see the interpreter in a bigger view, you can pin the interpreter by clicking on the 3 dots at the top right corner of the interpreter's window. So I hope all of you are now comfortable in terms of the accessibility settings. If you need any other assistance, please feel free to contact the organizers of this event. So why are we looking at intersectionality today in terms of disability and LGBTI populations? Intersectionality provides us a framework through which we can move beyond identity, where we can look at existing systems of oppression and subordination and the interplay of those different systems of subordination and oppression and the impact it has on lives of multiply marginalized people in global society. When we look at disability, ableism, the concept of who a normal person is, the practices behind that normative ideology also influence our understanding of gender and sexuality and cis heteropatriarchal normative ideas and ideals of what is considered normal. Intersectionality shows us that we're not discrete people with separate and discrete identities. Rather, we have a a lived experience at the meeting point of multiple axes of identity and axes of oppression. And this experience can change in terms of our potential privileges and our potential oppression, depending on our relation dynamics. So intersectionality really allows us to have a much more dynamic understanding of multiple oppression and multiple subordination. Intersectionality, I'm coming from a global South perspective, and from that perspective enables us to explore the context of the intersection of LGBTI populations and persons with disabilities, especially in terms of the colonial legacy, where persons at the intersection of these two forms of oppression have been criminalized, have been institutionalized, and have been invalidated on multiple counts, where we see our struggles as separate, especially from a post-colonial and also even a neo-colonial context, where we look at identity politics, which do not necessarily sit well with communities that have a preference for communal identity. These still continue to impact on how we live and how we navigate our social settings. Similarly, when we look at intersectionality as a lens for advocacy, as a lens for change, looking at how we can create those cross-movement collaborations, how we can make sure that we don't exclude persons who are also multiply marginalized from our movements in our collective vision and collective endeavor for social justice. Intersectionality shows us the divergent ways in which we devalue people in terms of citizenship, how we base that on a very limited, very ableist, very normative idea of the productive and reproductive citizen, and how these forms of discourse and practice then influence people who are multiply marginalized. And also to keep in mind that although we are focusing specifically on LGBTI populations and disability in this webinar today, that there are also other multiple forms of oppression, gender, race, class, ethnicity, a host of other factors that come into play when we look at the power place in operation at a global level. So given this wider context, we want to look at how can this lens of intersectionality, of factoring in the dynamic effects of multiple oppression, be brought into our analysis and exploration of human rights frameworks. That is one of our key questions and goals for today. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers investigating different aspects of that application and also the implications of this intersection. I would like to ask all persons who are not speaking to mute their microphones, and also for all persons who are not speaking to turn the video feature off because that will facilitate the sign language interpretation process. I want to remind everyone that this is a safe space, a respectful space, and a loving space, and there will be no tolerance of ableism, transphobia, or homophobia. I want us all to commit to creating a space where we can openly speak of our ideas and experiences without fear or without limitation. I would also encourage speakers to speak slowly in order to assist the sign language interpreters and captioners. And all panelists will be reminded of their time limits by one of the staff. So later on, that you will also have the opportunity to ask questions from the panelists. So if you look at your Zoom screen, at the bottom of the panel, you have the Q&A feature. So you can use this feature during the course of the event to type questions, and we will visit those questions as deemed appropriate at the end of the event. So a lot to explore during the course of the next 2 hours during today's event. And to start us off, I would like to introduce the ambassador of the Permanent Mission of Mexico, Her Excellency Mrs. Socorro Flores Liera, to make her welcome statement. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I thank Ilka for the invitation to this important event that allows us to participate in a discussion converging two priority matters for Mexico in human rights matters. One, the challenges faced by LGBTI people, and two, disabilities. They are both a clear example of the importance to adopt an intersectionality approach to fight effectively any form of discrimination. The Special Rapporteur on the human rights of people with disabilities explains in their reports the way in which stereotypes and prejudice rooted in society and institutions hinder and have hindered the effective access of people with disabilities to matters as basic as information, education, and sexual health and reproductive services. In addition to this, the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity has pointed out that exclusion is stressed when people with disabilities suffer from discrimination due to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics. We cannot overlook that one of the main challenges faced by LGBTI people with disabilities is to develop their identity and exercise their sexuality autonomously and with full respect of their privacy. To that end, it is indispensable to do an integral analysis of the obstacles faced by LGBTI people with disabilities in the different spheres of life, and to foster adoption and setting into motion of the necessary measures to guarantee the fulfillment of the dispositions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the main international instruments for human rights. In this line, a crucial aspect is to ensure the participation and full and effective inclusion of LGBTI people with disabilities in society. Their involvement in decision-making contributes to creating social awareness, changing cultural patterns, and for their specific needs to be addressed in the design and implementation of public policies. The states, in close cooperation with LGBTI people with disabilities, must review the legislative and institutional framework seeking to avoid reinforcing visions such as ableism and heteronormativity. Likewise, it is necessary to foster investigation and data collection and statistic collection that will allow us to identify and measure the impact that intersectionalities have in the development and full enjoyment of rights and fundamental liberties among this sector of the population. The work and the recommendations issued by special procedures and treaty agencies from an intersectional perspective are highly useful to guide states, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders to fight stigmatization faced by LGBTI people with disabilities. The road ahead is still difficult, and because of that, this dialogue space is highly valuable to reflect upon the challenges and ways to foster the effective promotion and protection of the rights of LGBTI people with disabilities. The results here will contribute to trigger further discussions with an intersectionality approach. Much success to you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your insights and reflections, Ambassador Flores. Next, we move on to the Ambassador from the Permanent Mission of New Zealand, Her Excellency Mrs. Anna Louise Duncan. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Ambassador, we cannot hear you. Maybe you need to choose the English language in the globe. Sorry.
If you could go to the bottom of your Zoom panel.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you now. Fantastic.
That's great. Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. In the language of New Zealand's Indigenous people, my warm greetings to you all. Thank you for the opportunity to support today's event and to welcome you all to what I am sure will be a fruitful and informative discussion. I would like to acknowledge the work that ILGA and their partners have put into making today's discussion possible. I would also like to acknowledge the participation of the Special Rapporteur on Disabilities, the UN Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, the Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, my dear colleague, Her Excellency the Ambassador of Mexico, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and of course, representatives of LGBTI persons with disabilities from around the world. The rights of persons with disabilities and rights related to sexual orientation and gender identity are top-tier priorities for New Zealand's international engagement and advocacy on human rights. New Zealand is pleased to work with Mexico on the Human Rights Council resolution on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and to support the mandates of both special rapporteurs with us today. We are also proud to have a New Zealander, Sir Robert Martin, sharing his experience as a current member of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Intersectionality is about recognizing the diversity of our experiences and ensuring equal rights for all. We know that some individuals face multiple barriers in accessing their human rights, such as Indigenous women or LGBTI persons with disabilities. Their everyday lives can be severely impacted by intersectional discrimination. The High Commissioner for Human Rights recently called on the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms to continue to analyze the depth of intersectional discrimination. We hope that today's discussion will contribute to that work. It is a privilege to be able to learn from you all today. I look forward to hearing your ideas on how we can address the barriers faced by LGBTI persons with disabilities and ensure that everyone is able to access and enjoy their human rights. I'm going to conclude with a saying in the Indigenous language of New Zealand, Te Reo Māori, and it means, let us keep close together, not far apart. Waiho I te toi poto, kawa I te toi roa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Duncan. We really appreciate your presence here today and your commitment to recognizing the diverse experiences of persons at the margins of these intersections, and for your reminder of how these multiple factors come into play in our lived experiences as complex human beings. I would just want to bring your attention to the fact that the links for closed captioning have been shared on the chat box for this Zoom session. So if you do need that, you can again visit the links on the chat box. If you have any access related needs or requirements, please feel free to use the Q&A function to inform the organizers of any needs or issues that you may be having. So that said, we will now move on to a statement that has been shared with us by Ms. Rosemary Case, who is the chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. For those who may not be aware, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the primary international instrument that highlights and promotes the rights of persons with disabilities at a global level. The committee monitors and holds states accountable and looks at the effective implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has now been approved by 182 countries. Making her statement today via video is Ms. Rosemary Case, the chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So if we could move to her statement now.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can, but it's still, yeah, we can.
Hello, I'm Rosemary Case, Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'd like to thank ILGA World and all the co-organisers and co-sponsors for the opportunity to participate in this important side event. This side event provides a critical forum for me to present a contemporary understanding of how intersectionality is embedded in the human rights framework, and specifically through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. The Convention was the first human rights treaty adopted in the 21st century. The Convention shifts our understanding of disability from one of individual deficit requiring care, treatment and protection systems to a human rights model that affirms all people with disability are of equal worth and value and must be afforded all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with others. Central to this is the recognition that disability is one of several layers of identity. Preambular paragraph P of the Convention acknowledges the different layers or intersections of identity and recognises that this can result in intersectional discrimination and inequality. Other international human rights instruments have also recognised different layers of identity, but the Convention is the first human rights treaty to explicitly and comprehensively address intersectional discrimination. Intersectional discrimination recognises the multidimensional layers of identity, statuses and life realities that interact with each other at the same time in such a way as to be inseparable. It acknowledges that people with disability do not experience discrimination and inequality as a homogenous group. While intersectional discrimination is specifically articulated in the Convention in Article 6, Women with Disabilities, and Article 7, Children with Disabilities, it is critical to recognise that Articles 6 and 7 are illustrative of intersectionality and not exhaustive. So the Convention does not contain specific articles or references to LGBTI or SOGIESC identities and population groups, but it's clear that the Convention recognises intersectionality broadly. The broad concept of intersectionality is reflected within the work of the committee and is essential for progressing the rights of all people with disability. Our committee has made important progress in the inclusion of the rights of LGBTI people with disabilities, particularly through several general comments and numerous concluding observations following the review of states parties. The growing body of jurisprudence from the committee reflects the dynamic nature of international law and its ability to address contemporary and emerging human rights issues. So it is a catalyst for progressing human rights protections. This can only work when people bring human rights issues before us. So it's the work of groups such as ILGA World and ILGA Oceania, and in particular its establishment of a disability subcommittee, that facilitate the progress of human rights law and the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Engagement by LGBTI groups with the committee, informally and formally through state party reviews, individual communications and inquiries, as well as forums and activities such as this side event today, will enable our committee and the broader human rights framework to progress the rights of LGBTI persons with disabilities and provide guidance to states parties in implementing their human rights obligations. Thank you.
Right. I'm deeply touched by the statement made by Ms. Rosemary Case, the chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As she pointed out very effectively in her statement, when we look at populations, be it persons with disabilities or LGBTI people, we are very diverse. We are not a homogeneous group of persons. And often when you look at subordination and the marginalization of persons and the othering of persons, we are clumped into a very homogeneous groups. And we become what I would say the object of the ableist stare of those who do not fit in, those who are not normatively acceptable. And so to really emphasize the wonderful and the beautiful diversity of humanity across these multiple marginalities, which really makes intersectionality also an avenue of recognizing the diversity of human experience, was really very effectively underlined by Ms. Rosemary Case in her presentation. And also the commitment of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to uphold and to promote the rights of LGBTIQ persons with disabilities in a very proactive and committed way. I also just want to recap on those who have made this event possible today. As I mentioned at the start, ILGA World, ILGA Oceania, OII Europe, looking at issues of intersex persons in a European context. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the permanent missions of Mexico and New Zealand. And we have heard from the ambassadors of the permanent missions from Mexico and from New Zealand already. And also another key partner for this program is CREA, a global South-led feminist human rights organization that very proactively engages with issues around disability, gender, and sexuality. So of those individuals representing the organizers of this event, we come now to Mr. Michael van Gelder, who will be representing the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is co-hosting this event. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Michael van Gelder. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Niluka. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, colleagues, friends, the UN Human Rights Office is really pleased to co-host this event together with ILGA World, CREA, ILGA Oceania, OII Europe, and the permanent missions of Mexico and New Zealand. The rights of people with disabilities and of lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and intersex people are priorities for the UN Human Rights Office. And I thank the organizers for their hard work that allows us to be together today to discuss the important topic of the human rights situation of lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and intersex people with disabilities. The United Nations member states have set out clear goals to make significant progress towards inclusive and sustainable development by 2030. including by ensuring that no one is left behind and fulfilling human rights obligations. But just in the past year, we have seen how in the context of the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, people with disabilities and LGBTI people have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and by the restrictions put in place to contain it, but also left behind in the socio-economic responses to the impact of the pandemic. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality more than 30 years ago to describe how specifically racism and sexism do not operate independently, but instead interact to exacerbate and deepen the inequality, violence, and discrimination in the lives of Black women. As already highlighted by speakers today, discrimination against people with disabilities and discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics also exacerbate and deepen the inequality, violence, and discrimination in the lives of LGBTI people with disabilities, both historically and today. Even though there has been some progress in integrating intersectional perspectives in the work of states, the United Nations, and civil society, I think we can all agree that there is a long way to go. Too often, still today, human rights work and policies operate in silos, including in relation to the human rights of LGBTI people and the work of the rights of people with disabilities. And the result is that LGBTI people with disabilities are left behind. A few existing studies already highlight a number of concerns with regards to the situation of LGBTI persons with disabilities, and some have already been mentioned. Lack of access to health, including mental health and sexual and reproductive health and rights, higher levels of bullying in and exclusion in education, additional barriers in employment, high levels of stigma and discrimination when accessing public services, lack of disability-inclusive community spaces that welcome LGBTI people with disabilities, and also the fact that some LGBTI people, including intersex persons, may be living with disabilities that were caused as a result of human rights violations they faced based on their sex characteristics, including medically unnecessary surgery and treatment performed on them as children. And yet there has been a lack of recognition and remedy in relation to these harms. As already highlighted, more resources and research are required in order to properly document and address these issues. Also, given the wide diversity among LGBTI people with disabilities. I once again thank the organizers and look forward to hearing from the experts on today's panel about how we can advance inclusion and protection from discrimination and violence for all lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and intersex people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Michael Van Gerden, representing the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I think some really key points made there, where there is a tendency for us to work in silos, to look at different identity groups, whether it be in relation to gender, so women, children, persons with disabilities. There's a tendency for us to work in isolation and focus particularly on one or two vulnerable groups. But this is an invitation, and especially through the examination of this particular topic in this event, it's an invitation for us to really bring intersectionality into our work as we navigate much more complex and diverse identities as opposed to very individualistic ways and purely identity-based ways of working on matters that actually have a very strong intersectional foundation to them. So thank you for that reminder, and I hope that that would be a motivation for us to then, during the course of the panels today, explore where can we collaborate? Where is there avenue for cross-movement collaboration, for cross-treaty collaboration, and for the visibility and representation of those who actually inhabit the space of LGBTI persons with disabilities. So that really gives us a good foundation for our next section for today's event, which is the panel discussion. Today we have some excellent, distinguished and very knowledgeable people sharing their insights and their experiences with us. We are very honored to have with us Mr. Gerard Quinn, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We are also honored to have with us Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz, who is the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We are also very fortunate to have three fantastic human rights defenders who work at the intersections of disability and sexuality, namely Po Kimani, Margarita Coppolino, and Dan Christian Gattas. So to start off our first panel session, I would like to invite Mr. Gerard Quinn and Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz. Mr. Gerard Quinn, as most of you know, is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, who occupied this office in October 2020. He has 2 research chairs at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute on Human Rights and at the University of Leeds. He previously held a chair at the National University of Ireland, and he is one of the founders and directors of the Centre on Disability Law and Policy. He has served on the Irish Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities, Ireland Human Rights Commission, and the Council of State in Ireland. Thank you so much, Mr. Gerard Quinn, for making time to be with us here today. Our other panelist for this session is Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz. He is the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. He's a Costa Rican jurist who was a senior visiting researcher at Harvard's law school, at the Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program. He has a background as Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims and is a member of the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture. So 2 highly knowledgeable, stellar individuals participating in the panel today. So the first question I really want to ask both of you is that in your work, you have both listed intersectionality as a key principle, right? So I want to ask you, why is this intersectional approach important? What is the value of it? And why should we specifically look at LGBTI persons with disabilities? So first, if you could respond, Mr. Quinn, on this particular issue.
Thank you, Niluka. And I want to thank ILGA and its co-organizers for opening up this incredibly important space. Let me pay tribute in passing to the governments of Mexico and New Zealand. Mexico and New Zealand were critically important in getting the Treaty on the Rights of People with Disabilities off the ground. And in fact, they provide ongoing critical support to my mandate and to other mandates. And let me associate myself closely with the words of Rosemary Cayas, the chair of the UN CRPD committee. She is absolutely right in emphasizing that the treaty almost uniquely opened up intersectional space, particularly on 1 or 2 grounds, and that the committee has shown real flexibility of mind in reaching hidden intersectional issues. And I think there's huge potential in that. So the question basically was, why is intersectionality important to me in my work? Why did I give it such an emphasis in our work program, our vision statement? And I have to tell you that more recently, the UN Human Rights Council had a session on my mandate, and this was one of the things most states spoke about approvingly. I think there's 3 reasons why it's critically important. The first has to do with a sense of absence or a sense of loss, or maybe a deficit or a blind spot, if I could use that word in a non-political sense, in our traditional paradigms. We all intuit that something important is missed by ground-centric approaches to equality, by identity-centric approaches to equality. They continue to be very important and indeed historically critical for particular groups in society, but nevertheless, they miss something quite crucial in the human condition, which has to do with the plasticity of identity and not with the kind of artificial labeling of individuals into one or other groups. And I think we've reached the limit of the ground-centric approach. It's overly reductionist and simply doesn't fit with our common intuitions about what it means to be a person or a human being. Secondly, I think the intersectional approach pushes us to ask deeper and more probing questions about why it is we experience the inequality we experience. What are the sources of invisibility, of oppression, and of marginalization? Does it have to do with economic interests of one group over another? Does it have to do with assertions or ascriptions of moral superiority or inferiority of one group over another? Has it to do with devaluing the person because of their perceived less use value in society and in the economy? What are the real wellsprings of devaluation and exclusion? And shouldn't we be tackling those as a priority rather than or in addition to the actual ripple effects of that inequality on the surface, so to speak? Are these well springs shared across grounds? Are there continuities and discontinuities in the way the person is valued or devalued across grounds? So the traditional approach does not really give us an occasion to ask these deeper questions. We may do so, but it's not ingrained in the DNA of the traditional approach. And indeed, the traditional approach suffered from what might be called a diachronic perspective, a synchronic perspective. We look at how you're treated right now compared to another group. What's absent from the focus is how did you arrive at where you're at? What were the accumulated disadvantages you bring with you to the table? And do you bring them because you share certain identities and characteristics and not because of one label exclusively? And thirdly, most importantly, and I'll stop here, I think the value of the intersectional approach is that it asks us to formulate solutions that are more sustainable into the future. And for example, what is the point of deinstitutionalization for people with disabilities if we, on the other hand, institutionalize older people? And we know through the pandemic that it's older people, particularly older people with ongoing conditions, medical conditions, who have suffered the most during the pandemic. It makes no sense to have a lily pad approach, a ground-centric approach to a very important theme, which is how do human beings flourish in life and in the community, unless we're actually applying those solutions, as it were, across grounds. I think there are many interesting applications of the intersectional perspective to people with disabilities and the LGBTI groups and other groups as well. And I will stop here because 5 minutes is my limit. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this fantastic overview, Mr. Quinn. So moving on to Mr. Madrigal-Bolos, same question. Why is intersectionality something that we need to look at? And why do we really look at the needs of LGBTI persons with disabilities?
Thank you very much, Niluka. I'm looking at you to make sure that you can hear me well. Thank you.
Yes, you can.
Thank you very much for your very able moderation of this, I believe, historic event, where we are talking about this extraordinary point of intersection between the areas that concerns us all. I'd also like to thank, of course, the organizers for putting together this event, and pay my respect to Ambassadors Flores Liera and Duncan. And I hope that Ambassador Flores Liera, who I know for a very long time, will not mind if I also express how delighted I am at her appointment as judge of the International Criminal Court as the first composition that will reach gender parity in that extraordinary body. And I salute that historic composition of the ICC in that connection. I could give you a very simple answer in relation to why is intersectionality a keystone, a key part of my work, and that is because the very smart and people who negotiated the contents of the resolution that provides for my mandate were insightful enough to actually make it one of the two principles that actually guides all of the work that I do. Those being one, dialogue, and the other one, intersectionality. And I think in that connection, the crafting of the resolution that expressed the political willingness to acknowledge sexual orientation and gender identity for as a point of entry into the analysis of phenomena and of violence and discrimination, crucially understood that it would be only a point of entry, a prism through which to examine the rich kaleidoscope of human experiences that actually manifest themselves in lived experiences of privilege or discrimination. Now, my colleague Gerard, who is a wise and learned man, has given us a wonderful framework to operate on. First, what are the reasons why ground-centric and segmented approaches have limitations that we should resist? But also, he has given us a notion of opportunity in relation to what intersectionality brings as a tool in the analysis to deconstruct violence and discrimination. Now, in my experience of dealing with the issues connected with my mandate, I have identified three particular areas of work where I believe intersectional analysis brings richness to the analysis and provides for a pathway to what is very concrete understanding of how the crafting of these lives creates particular experiences of violence, which is precisely what we want to address. Having said that, one word of, if not caution, at least to share with you one of the great challenges of working within this field and within intersectionality, and that is, in the words of the wonderful writer Saramago, if you needed a map that is big enough to describe every place on Earth, you'd probably need a map as big as Earth. I extrapolate this to saying, if you needed a page long enough to describe the specificity of every human experience, you'd probably need a page as big as human experience. And so my challenge when I work with intersectionality is how to understand the extraordinary diversity and unicity in every lived experience and the way in which every person reunites many identities in their body, while at the same time being able to describe human experiences through points of entry that actually allow us to understand the impact of those experiences in general public policy or access to justice or legislation. And 3 points to me have become salient point of meeting when it comes to intersectional analysis. The first one is the experience of stigma and prejudice, both external, but also internalized stigma and prejudice within our communities, populations, and peoples. And I believe that this is an area where there is such significant work carried out in the treaty bodies and the NGOs working in the field of persons living with disabilities and sexual orientation and gender identity, where we can draw on each other's knowledge about the cause and the consequence of stigma in our lived experiences. The second one is the narrative of cures. The idea that there is something to cure in the experience of persons impacted by violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and the idea that there is something to cure in the lived experience of persons living with disabilities. And finally, and most importantly, the narrative of LGBTIQ+ lives or gender diverse lives as political identities, and likewise the narrative of persons living with disabilities and their different identities under which they identify as political identities as well. These are areas of meeting where I think intersectionality achieves a pragmatic dimension where we can immediately see how analysis, for example, of the ability of persons to openly use and interact with public spaces is directly connected with human rights and development priorities. And I think that in this case, while I appreciate enormously the importance of the political statement of having these identities as point of entry in the analysis, and while I understand the historic and absolutely essential nature of the statement on intersectionality as an essential methodology for work, I also think that we need to couple that with the very pragmatic tools that will allow us to actually provide some solutions that for people that are waiting for them in relation to their very real everyday challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Madrigal-Boloz, for that very insightful look into especially the cross experiences or the shared experiences that LGBTI populations and persons with disabilities experience, the normative practices that lead to stigma, prejudice, discrimination, the medicalization, the pathologization of these populations, especially in the global south, and the need to take the concept of intersectionality and then translate it to very relatable, to very practical frameworks of intervention. I will now move on to our second set of questions, and if you could just provide a very brief answer, both Mr. Quinn and Mr. Madrigal-Boloz. So the question is, can you share an example, either from your own work or other human rights mechanisms, where intersectionality was used to protect the rights of LGBTI persons with disabilities? Mr. Gerard Quinn.
Thank you, Niluka. Just 2 points, 2 very brief points. One from personal experience and one setting out an ambition for the future. First of all, personal experience. Most of us have started our careers on a ground-centric issue. For me, it's disability. For others, it would be age or race or whatnot. And only slowly have we come to appreciate the seepage from these grounds, one into the other, and then the underlying tectonic connections. For me, it happened to be in the early 2000s when I was developing theories of civil death for people with disabilities, trying to explain the persistence of guardianship, the disappearance of the personhood of the individual, and the placing or the displacing of that personhood in the hands of third parties like guardians. At one and the same time, I was sitting on a Human Rights Commission with a very, very eminent advocate on LGBT rights, Catherine Zappone, who went on to be a minister in our government. And we got talking about the concept of civil death. And she turned up to a meeting of advocates with intellectual disabilities. And this was prior to our referendum on equal marriage. And she said, to the astonishment of the audience, you know, I'm just like you. I can't get married either. And that really set off a whole train of interactions and mind-opening events. And I'm quite convinced that it was the disability community that really rode in behind the equal marriage referendum, and the LGBTI community also supported us in legislating Europe's first assisted decision-making legislation for people with disabilities. So it was a very brief aha moment that not only opened up more avenues of inquiry, but led to very, very practical changes as a result. Secondly, the ambition going forward. This is the main reason why I set out the ambition to explore what I called hidden intersectionalities in my work program, which was presented recently. So I focused on some grounds or intersecting grounds that bubbled to the surface during the drafting of the Disability Treaty, but never quite made it into the body of the text, simply because there weren't enough people in the room. And that has to do with Indigenous persons with disabilities, prisoners with disabilities, and older persons with disabilities. However, that doesn't preclude ongoing and intensive work on LGBTI, SOGI, and disability, and I'm very keen to do that, and very, very open and flexible into the future. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerard Quinn. Really, and your commitment to exploring and exposing hidden intersectionality, I think, is of great value for the disability community and the LGBTI community. Mr. Victor Madrigal Bolos, same question to you. Any examples of you looking at the intersectionality perspective when it comes to the protection of the rights of LGBTI persons with disabilities?
I would say that the most salient example is, of course, that relating to our current work in trying to understand exactly the dynamics of agency under international human rights law and their connection with historically enforced notions of capacity and mental illness, for example. And as you know, there is a long tradition of work concerning depathologization of particular sexual orientation and gender identities. And in my view, that essentially has been the result of intersectional understanding of the lived realities of persons who have been subjected to those frameworks. Having said that, the protective work can be looked at from very many perspectives, of course. And you see in the development of the doctrine and the case law of treaty bodies and special procedures, you see a number of statements coming through, typically as the result of the very good input provided by civil society, in which intersectionality is now taken as a basic concept for understanding the scope of general obligations of states. And that includes, of course, the reference of intersection, most particularly of gender issues and issues affecting people living with disabilities. You see General Recommendation 28 of the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and its implementation in different doctrine and case law. Of course, there is the jurisprudence of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and a plethora of other statements that, in my view, will provide significant grounding for the manner in which this development is taking place.
Thank you very much, Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz. I think something that both of you really mentioned is this whole concept of personhood and agency, and the basic concept of human dignity, which is often lost in the process of marginalization and subjugation, and really the need to emphasize on that dignity of persons with disabilities, dignity of persons who identify as LGBTI, and the recognition of their capacity and agency is really important, and that is one underlying need that is addressed through intersectional work. And I'm so happy to hear of the experiences that both of you shared, to see that we are really moving in that direction, which is a vital direction. So thanks for the wonderful first round of our panel. We are now going to move to the next round of our panel. And for this, we will have some fantastic human rights defenders, grassroots level human rights defenders who have an extensive experience of working at the intersections of disability and LGBTI based issues. Before going into that, I would just like to remind the attendees that if you have any questions or concerns at this point, please use the Q&A function to ask questions. We're not doing the raise hands at this point, so please avail yourselves of the Q&A function. So for this second round of the panel, I would love to invite Po Kimani. Po Kimani is a genderqueer, social and healing justice activist who is guided by love and transformational justice. They have over 20 years of experience working with civil society and advocacy, and providing awareness and training on human rights. They are at the forefront of the struggle for queer and trans liberation, and co-developed the first initiatives in support of queer women and intersex, trans, and non-binary people in Kenya and Uganda. Po Kimani is a person with chronic illness, and their work centers on the liberation in body politics that are expansive to the ways in which our bodies exist. So a wonderful and complex approach to looking at intersectionality. Po Kimani, welcome, and thank you for being on this panel. Next, I would like to introduce you to Margarita Coppolino. Margarita is an inclusion/intersectionality consultant and a photographer. She was appointed as ILGA Oceania's Disability Subcommittee Chair and Director on the Drummond and Queer Spaceport. Margarita's experience also includes being on the National Ethnic Disability Alliance, serving as its president, and the Victoria Ministerial LGBTI Task Force and SPS Community Advisory Committees. So two individuals with a very extensive experience, both personally and in terms of their work of working at the intersections. The first question that I have to both of you is if you could briefly map the main human rights challenges faced by LGBT persons with disabilities in your country or region. So what are some of the key issues affecting LGBT persons with disabilities in terms of the work that you do? So Po, we will first go with you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I want to start by stating that there is a lot of work that has been done to get us here, and there's even more work to get us to where we are free, where our bodies exist in the freedom that allows us to be powerfully ourselves and to have the agency to break down the systems that keep holding us back. So I want to start with placing myself in this movement. My name is Paul Kimani. Yes, I am 35 years old. I'm a Kenyan citizen. I live in an intersex body. I am a non-binary, trans-masculine movement builder. I have mostly come to those identities through the disappointment of institutions like the Kenyan constitution that identifies me as a human being worthy of human rights, and then immediately erases me for being queer, for being intersex, for living in a body that's red, female, and thus exposed to patriarchy, to sexism. And now as I grow older, and as I have to hold chronic pain and I have to live through chronic illness, the systems that insist that then I'm not valuable enough, or my value comes when there are policies that can describe my experience. And yet, so many of us are living in chronic pain, are living disabled, are living having to contest and take care of each other in the systems that essentially are calling us to run away from our realities or to prove our realities so that they can be heard. So I'm a sex worker. I am Black. And my body allows me to exist in those ways every day, every day. For that, disability justice for me is having to identify with how much struggle I've had to get the courage and the agency to speak about my life, to share the experience of what it means to live in my body with chronic illness, with immunocompromised ways that my body show up and my mind show up. I also recognize that all that pain amounts to a lot more disability, because then what is my mental wellness? And how do I show up in the spaces that are available for me to contest my wellness? Having to do the work, having to carry the burden of being the person with disability, of being the person in the pain. So at this point for me, the question comes completely back to us as the people organizing, as the mobilizers who are finding the language and who are popularizing the language to articulate the agency each one of us has. I want for us to stop and realize what it means truly for anybody who's disabled, for anybody who lives in chronic pain, that ableism is entrenched in our political vehicles. That for me to show up at any of those meetings, the conversation mostly had is the logistical access that people can afford me. And yet social justice is about our healing, is about us being able to name the systems as violent and problematic. And for us to do that, we risk being invited to the table. So I'm thinking that there's a lot of work that we need to do to move away from disability justice being just about meeting venues and issues being represented, without each one of us questioning how we participate to reinforce and reentrench this idea that bodies are worthy in a paradigm where some bodies have different abilities, and those bodies then have the work to show what is the problem with the system we exist in. I think it's so important for us to name this ableism that exists in our fat phobia, the ableism that exists in the sexism we live in, the capitalism that's around public health access, the capitalism that's around the systems that are vehicles of our freedom. I want to speak a little bit about access in ways that COVID-19 has allowed me to really get into myself. I was unable to access my medication for more than 6 months. I am very reliant in that way, but it required that my whole village, my whole network, and my whole support system recognized that they needed to give up so much of their privilege for me to be alive right now. And that allows me to see that, yes, we can accept the work even when the pain is not on us, that we recognize the unique needs for people living in all sorts of dynamics, that also access has to look like tenderness, like kindness, like compassion, like community care, like uplifting mutual aid, because this is the tool that we are using to heal, and that we as a community are closing the gaps of isolation, not just for people who are living with disability or chronic illness or people who are identified or identify as disabled, but each one of us who is invested in social justice. I want also to imagine that in this room and in every other room I'm invited to, there is space for us to continue creating and encompassing all of us and the ways all of us need care and can give care to each other. So I feel that a lot of the work that has gone on has given us language to get here. A lot of the work that needs to continue going on is honestly on each one of us here, and in understanding how ableism is central to everything that we live in, and that the work being left to people with disability, to people in chronic illness, does not change the dynamics of organizing, does not liberate us any faster. And I'm also grateful that in a time when we have global pandemics that allow us to negotiate for better ways of existing and to not go back to the normal, we have the capacity to do that. Thank you.
Great. Beautiful, Po. Thank you so much for bringing that fantastic perspective into the discussion today of bodies of worthiness, bodies of value, and bodies of mutual care. I would like to now move on to Margarita Coppolino. Same question to you, Margarita. Can you tell us a bit about, the situation when it comes to human rights of persons who are LGBT and persons with disabilities in your country or region? So, sorry, Margarita. I'm sorry, Margarita, we can't hear you. Not yet. Can you just check on your microphone? Select the English channel, please. Okay. If you can go to the globe icon at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom screen and select the English channel, perhaps that will help.
That's right.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Is that better? Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Okay, so before I start, some of the things that we do here in Australia is that we normally acknowledge the traditional landowners of the land, which so I would like to acknowledge all Indigenous landowners that this Zoom meetings occurring across the world. I pay my respects to everybody. So I just want to talk a little bit about me personally before I go into talking about the main human rights challenge faced by LGBTIQ people with disabilities in Australia and Oceania, is that every day I personally have to come out of my 3 closets. I have to come out about my disability, I have to come out about my sexuality, and I have to come out about my coal background. So in it, that contents it actually creates really complex ways of people looking at me, because most people just see me as Margarita with a disability. They don't see me as all my other intersectional lens. So that personally means that coming out of the closet and having those conversations around intersectionality encourages people to see the whole me and not just a small part of me. So let's just talk about Australia and New Zealand. In 2013, New Zealand legalised the same-sex marriage, followed by Australia in 2017. Yet the rest of Oceania, the Pacific Islands, yet do not have the same-sex marriage. In 2018, the UN CRPD, General Comments number 7, referenced that state parties must consult with LGBTIQA people with disabilities for the first time. I remember that well. In fact, my person who's sitting next to me, a few and I were in New York at the time when that discussion happened. Somebody mentioned earlier that people haven't been at the table. Well, let me tell you now that there are no standalone national or regional voice for LGBTIQ people with disabilities within the mainstream community. LGBTIQA people with disability lens are always added after the LGBTIQ policy or program has been designed and implemented. So hold that thought for a moment. Both LGBTIQA and disability civil societies have not always been inclusive of the LGBTIQ people with disabilities and other intersectional lens communities. No or little co-design with people with disabilities in policies and programs that have impact on their lives has happened. State parties have not always had LGBTIQA links in their policies and program work. But let's talk about what's happening on the ground. LGBTIQA people with disabilities experience higher rates of violence, neglect, abuse, and discrimination. Since 2017, there's been a number of researchers that have occurred coming out of Australia on those issues, very well documented. LGBTIQ people with disabilities, lots of them are discriminated in education and employment. And you'll hear more about that in another event coming up soon on the general comment around employment of people with disabilities. LGBTIQ people with disabilities are not getting access to IVF, family planning, health promotions, and accessible health and health sexual services and programs. Ableism, word you heard mentioned before, exists within the LGBTI community as a whole. Venues and community events are inaccessible. LGBTIQA conferences are not always accessible to LGBTIQ people with disabilities due to accessible costs or lack of budget to cover those costs. Intersectional lens communities, conversations are not heard often. This is a blessing in disguise that in the last couple of months we're hearing much more and we've been invited to the table. And last but not least, one very close to my heart is housing and homeless. I'll give an example. Most people would know group homes, particularly where lots of people with disabilities are living in a group home. When you've got a tenant who is identified as part of the LGBTI community may not disclose their sexuality due to potential violence or bullying by their co-tenants and support workers. I can tell you this is very much the case that happened during COVID, particularly with long lots of lockdown. That's all for me on this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Margarita. I love the term you use, the tapestry of the complexity of who we are. You know, it's beautiful. And that's something that we really need to look at when we focus on the whole topic of intersectionality and also the recognition that there is ableism in the LGBTIQ community. And similarly, there is homophobia within the disability community. And these are realities that we have to deal with, especially those of us who occupy the intersections of these different forms. And thank you also for bringing in the perspective of housing and homelessness, which often goes unspoken in discussions around intersectionality. So thank you very much for that. We will move to our second round of questions for both of you. And if you can just give like a very brief answer, you don't have to necessarily explicate this, is whether you have any examples or ideas on how international human rights mechanisms and governments can help in advancing the rights of LGBT persons with disabilities. So Margarita, we can start with you.
So thank you. This is my favorite part, actually, my favorite question. I could talk to the cows go home, but I won't. Look, I think the first thing I'd like to start off with is, I did mention around the UN CRPD General Comment number 7. And I want to highlight that the obligation of the state parties to consult with LGBTIQ people with disabilities. And that was really quite significant when it happened. I remember being in New York with sitting beside me and myself, some of the interventions when that general comment was being discussed, acknowledge the CRPD committee at the time for keeping that particular reference to LGBTIQ in the general comment, because it has definitely been a starting point and a catalyst for where we are now. I also need to mention that currently the state parties and the civil societies do not report at the annual UN CRPD costs on their work around LGBTIQ. I mean, I know I just mentioned that in 2018, there was a side event on LGBTIQ, and there was one just last year, and they were actually side events, but it would be really good for state parties to actually do a reporting on what work they are doing around LGBTIQ in their country. And also civil societies reporting on that. Now, I did mention earlier that ILGA World Regional Conference, ILGA World Conference in 2019 in Wellington, New Zealand. At the ILGA Oceania caucus, a motion was actually put forward at that meeting to introduce a disability chair. Now, 12 months later, at the ILGA Oceania 2020 AGM, the motion was carried and a disability chair was introduced into the constitution and the first chair was elected. The first ILGA World region to do so. What was also really quite significant about that AGM is that the official language policy was also being amended. And what also got agreed to was that international sign interpreting language would actually also be recognized as an official language.
I'm sorry, sorry, my dear. I'm so sorry to cut you mid-sentence. If you could please wrap up, because in consideration of the time. Sorry, you just if you can make your concluding remarks. Thank you so much, Margarita, for sharing your very extensive practical experiences with navigating human rights frameworks and platforms. Po, the question to you is the same in terms of your experiences with working with human rights mechanisms to promote the rights of LGBTI persons with disabilities. If we can keep it very brief, because I am cognizant of the time, so I'm very sorry to cut you all off, but I would really appreciate it. Po, the floor is yours.
Okay. I would like to highlight the crisis, the refugee crisis that's both at Kakuma Block 13 and Nairobi urban refugees that impacts disabled, homeless refugees in ways that needs quick response, urgent response. And beyond that, just to insist that the conversation needs to move away from the convenient ways of working to a much more human focused, and then I think we can keep moving.
Thank you, fantastic, for really highlighting the need to also look at other human rights mechanisms, especially relating to refugees, when we look at advocacy around this particular topic. We will now move on to the next panel segment. And for this segment, we have with us Dan Christian Gattas. Dan is the Executive Director of OII Europe, which is the umbrella organization of European human rights-based intersex organizations. Dan has been working on intersex-related human rights issues since 2009, has expertise in a range of institutions, including the Maltese government, the Parliament of the European Union, and the UN Office on the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Dan is a very vocal advocate of disability rights, and in the context of intersex persons specifically. Dan is a vocal voice, and we are very lucky to have you with us today, Dan. Thank you for joining us. So my question to you is, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities made recommendations on both intersex persons and intersex persons with disabilities. How does this notion of disability relate to the notion of intersex? Over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much for the question. And please let me start by saying that I feel really honored to be part of this wonderful setup of speakers. Now, speaking about intersex and disability, both are strongly connected and intersect. So the lived realities of many intersex people and the social model of disability. So to begin with, like all people, intersex people can be born or in the course of their life acquire a physical or mental variation or impairment, and as we know, then face systemic barriers, derogatory attitudes, social exclusion, discrimination, and other human rights violations by society. And being an intersex person with disabilities will often add another layer of human rights violations. As you all know, intersex people are people who are born with sex characteristics which do not fit the normative societal understanding of male and female. And unfortunately, to this day, most societies across the globe have a very medicalized perspective on people with variations of sex characteristics. And being born with an intersex body means to have a body that is highly stigmatized to the point where the existence of intersex people is still ignored, neglected, and tabooed by society as a whole. So let me give you a few examples of how this translates into social practices even before an intersex child is born. If a fetus, for example, shows a certain variation of sex characteristics, doctors may encourage and even coerce future parents into aborting the child, even at a late stage. Pregnant individuals who carry an intersex child are often treated with a specific drug that aims to change the appearance of the child's genitalia already in the womb. And despite the fact that this drug has been proven to carry a high risk of long-term negative impact on the intellectual capacity of the future child and also impacts negatively on the childbearing person. Some regions in the world report infanticide of intersex infants. And across the globe, intersex individuals, especially infants, children, and adolescents, are still subjected to surgeries and other medical interventions with the aim to make them fit for and make them fit into society. And as you all know, these interventions are often non-vital and they are performed in absence of any concrete risk to the health of the person. And they are also very often performed at an age where consent to these procedures is given by parents or other persons having custody of the child. They also have been claimed, but never been scientifically proven, to lessen stigmatization and facilitate bonding between parent and child. And many shadow reports submitted by intersex organizations and activists show that this is clearly not the case. So when we look at all these practices from a perspective of the social model of disability, intersex and adults clearly face severe disabilities in the spirit of the CRPD. And it's also important to note the influence of early trauma, childhood surgeries, and hormone mismanagement, and what I mentioned, or the things I mentioned, on intersex individuals' physical and mental health. So many intersex individuals who were subjected to the interventions I just described acquire severe long-term physical and mental health impairments stemming from those treatments, to the point where, depending on the country, intersex people may receive disability status on the ground of an impairment, which is a result of an intervention on their healthy body. And recommendations that include both intersex people and intersex people with disabilities point equally to all three aspects and highlight how they're entwined. Intersex people are highly stigmatized through the notion that their healthy intersex bodies are impaired. Intersex people may acquire long-term physical and mental disability as a result of these non-consented interventions on those healthy bodies, and then hence become intersex people with a disability. And then the first thing that I mentioned in the very beginning, intersex people may be born or acquire a long-term impairment that is not connected in any way to their intersex body, but the fact that they are intersex will significantly aggravate the already immense challenges that they face as intersex persons with a disability. That's my answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Actually looking at how intersex persons, especially young children, are placed in a situation of vulnerability, which then leads to a higher experience or incidence of disability in the long run. Thank you for your insights on that matter. A quick second question from you, if you could briefly respond to this, is what is the role of disability framework in intersex human rights advocacy? So if you have any examples of any positive developments that you have achieved through this intersection between intersex persons and also the larger disability mandate.
Thanks. There are many, actually. I think it's important to understand that the visibility of intersex people that we now see rise step by step in the past years is very recent. So the first recommendations in 2009 and then ongoing have been key to raise awareness and actually confirm the existence of intersex people. We now have more than 50 concluding observations by different UN treaty bodies, 8 of which are from the CRPD. And in particular, all these recommendations have opened many doors and helped to start and intensify conversations across the globe and on national level, and also in Europe on regional level. And in our advocacy, in particular, the framework of the social definition of disability has helped a lot to put the finger on the dire consequences of social prejudice toward bodily diversity in general that intersex people like people with disabilities suffer from. And understanding these similarities has led to collaborations between intersex communities and communities of people with disabilities. For example, the community of deaf people in France. And similar to what Special Rapporteur Mr. Quinn reported, understanding the similarities of life experiences has been key. I don't know if I have the time to give a quick example. So you let me know and tell me if I'm going over time. But I vividly recall sitting next to a mother of a deaf child during a presentation about intersex human rights violation that had been organized together with the deaf community in France. And my colleagues reported about the situation of parents of intersex infants and children who faced the pressure to consent to cosmetic non-vital medical interventions. And they're presented with the claim that this will help them to bond with the child and save the child from being discriminated against later in life. And this mother of a deaf child sitting next to me literally started jumping up and down in her chair. And later she told me that doctors had used the exact same pressure and words with her when they asked her to consent to a cochlear implant for her infant. And she decided not to consent and to learn sign language instead. So discrimination cannot be solved by disrespecting the bodily integrity, autonomy, and self-determination of individuals. And you cannot solve a human rights violation by performing another one. And I think in the past decades, the community and movement of people with disabilities has worked hard, and with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities has made crystal clear that bodily and mental diversity does not allow any state or person to deprive people of their human rights. And the importance of understanding this and the baseline that this has created cannot be overestimated for all people, I would say, and this definitely includes intersex people that work towards ensuring their right to their own body. And as intersex activists, being a younger movement, the disability movement, we really build on this. And this, I would say, is a very important part that can be detailed, but I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Dan. And really your emphasis on the bodily integrity of intersex persons with disabilities, and the harmfulness of the pathologization of our bodies that are viewed as non-normative. Thank you for highlighting those factors. And I wish you the very best in the work that you do. We will now move on to the next segment of our panel. And for this, I would like to re-invite Mr. Gerard Quinn and Mr. Victor Madrigal-Bolos to come on board. I will first address Mr. Gerard Quinn. Mr. Quinn, in your opinion, what would you think is the most effective strategy to include disabled people's priorities in your mandate as the Special Rapporteur for persons with disabilities?
Thanks, Nailuka. Let me just say that I view the mandate as something that reacts to events, but also hopefully, ideally, something that anticipates events as well, and maybe prepares the global conversation for what is coming around the corner. I have a detailed work plan laid out. I'm not going to rehearse all of it for you. All I will say is that the first two projects are projects that eminently lend themselves to an intersectional approach. The first one is going to be on the protection of people with disabilities during armed conflicts, and spun a bit more positively, the positive contribution of people with disabilities to peace-building processes around the world. And this kind of speaks to a common theme running throughout today, which is personhood and human agency and visibility, or the lack thereof. So I would very, very much welcome inputs from your community in moving forward on our project on armed conflicts, which has already started. The second one, and I will end with that, is a project on artificial intelligence as it applies to people with disabilities. But obviously the risks are broader than simply the applications to the field of disability. To make a very long story short, machines, just as people, can harbor ableist and ageist and sexist assumptions. And since this is at the foundation of the terms of coexistence into the future, it's critically important that we do our best to purge these new machine learning tools of ableism, ageism, and sexism. So very, very much look forward to interaction with the LGBTI community on those two thematic projects. Let me also say that I very much welcome interaction with the LGBTI community in our country visits. We had two scheduled for last year, but they had to be postponed because of COVID. The first is to Botswana, and the second is to China. And I imagine there are many, many issues affecting your community that we really should be aware of before we conduct our country visits. Yeah, let me stop there. I'm sure there's more, but over to Victor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Victor Madrigal Bolos.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Poe and Margarita and Dan Christian very warmly, because I think that that's the most impactful thing that we know is to hear the position of the persons whose rights are at stake and with which we are supposed to be creating formulations. So I'm very thankful. And I will remark that a constant theme driven through all of these presentations is the notion of contribution to the social fabric and the ability and the recognition of the ability to people to contribute to the social fabric. I hope that I can convey to you with conviction and persuasion to what extent in my visit to countries, in the stories that I receive, in the testimonies that I hear, the recurrent theme for persons affected by violence and discrimination, be it out of sexual orientation and gender identity and their intersection with disability, is the idea that they are told pretty much from the day that they're born that they're not able to be good citizens, to contribute to that social fabric. And obviously this is what we want to dismantle. Strategies, I believe, need to take stock of a certain number of things. We want to be very principled. So intersectionality is a political decision first and foremost. This is why I'm delighted that it's in the resolution that creates my mandate, because it's guiding me there each and every time that I do this. But I also want to be very pragmatic about it. I also want to just take steps in my everyday life that will make it easy and possible for me to move in a way that it's actually faithful with this. Let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, Gerard and I talk. And one of the things that I'm proud to tell you is that the second that he was appointed, we reached out to each other and we said, let's talk to see what is it that we can do together in terms of our mandates and to identify points of intersection in relation to our mandates. And one of the things that I want to encourage civil society that works at this point of intersection is to actually provide us with good ideas about things that we can do together. But not only things that we can do together, but things where we can actually brief our colleagues across the board. One of the great privileges that Gerard and I both have in common is that we will have points of connection with most special procedures and with most treaty bodies. We are present everywhere in the concern of special procedures and treaty bodies. We are present everywhere in the human rights machinery. So I want to commend the work of civil society that has provided us so much material to understand how the lived experiences in people are actually reflecting in our work, motivate our work. But I want to encourage that you actually do more of it. And in this, Gerard also mentioned the interaction in country visits. Of course, that's very important. But I would like to underline that we also have the communication procedure, which feeds both in terms of individual redress, but also it feeds the international jurisprudence that is available. Survey around the keywords of disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity really only yields a handful of communications that actually address that point of intersection. And it would be important to get that case law understood. And finally, there's also clearly very much the issue of our thematic studies. Gerard mentioned already peace and security, as you know, because many of you know the work plan that I've crafted for 21-23. There's a number of reports that will be very relevant to these issues. My next report that I'm preparing right now has to do with gender theory. After that, I will be working on a report on health. I need not tell you the evident importance that this actually has for the point of connection. And then I will be working on issues of colonialism. And I think it was Poe who so eloquently brought some points about the connection between colonialism and understandings about ableism and the way that bodies are valued. Following that, I will also have a report on peace and peace building and peacekeeping. So undoubtedly, there will be some very important points in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz, for your interventions. And I think something that you said really struck with me. At the end of the day, intersectionality is a political decision and something that we need to commit to. So thank you for that message. Very briefly, moving to the last two questions, if you could just maybe, it's just, so the question basically is, how have LGBTI and disability human rights defenders, but also interested governments, how can they support your work to ensure that intersectional struggles faced by LGBTI persons with disabilities are properly addressed? So what kind of support can disability human rights defenders and interested governments, what kind of support can they provide you to enable you to do your work to your fullest capacity? Very quickly, we'll go to Mr. Madrigal-Borloz first.
Thank you very much. I think I can be brief because I already took the liberty to kind of go onto that field in what concerns civil society. I think recognizing those points of intersection in your research work, in your documentation work, in your fact-finding work, and then making it available to us through the different functions that we carry out. Now, when it comes to states, there is a very enabling framework that I recognize as part of my work of advice to states in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is the ASPIRE framework. And I believe it to be actually applicable to a range of issues apart from COVID-19. And I therefore am working on ways where I can establish an interlocution with states to understand how useful it could be to take political matters forward. ASPIRE is an acronym that stands for acknowledge the existence of LGBT persons everywhere, support LGBTI Q+ led organizations and serving organizations, protect them from violations of human rights, take indirect discrimination as a real risk in your risk assessment. Representation is key. Ensure that you do not formulate, implement, or evaluate policy without the presence of the concerned populations, communities, or persons. And finally, evidence-based approaches must be part of the response. Prejudice needs to be abandoned as a policy-making base, and evidence-based approaches, which necessitates immediately the ensuring that data gathering points are actually taken through in relation to this. My advice to states is basically surrounding those 6 points. And I would venture to say that it is an interesting framework for exploration in terms of the concerns of persons that are both impacted by violence based on SOGI and by realities of lived experience within disability. Thank you so much, Niluka. You've been very kind.
Thank you so very much. And over to you, Mr. Gerard Quinn.
So I think some common denominators are threading through the discussion this afternoon. One of them, of course, is personhood, what it means to be a person, which is actually a hotly debated topic, both within ethics as well as political philosophy and indeed in law. But nevertheless, it's important to go back to those basics. I think another common denominator has been human agency, my life, my way, and the importance of human agency. And maybe thirdly, a concept of flourishing, and particularly flourishing in the community, because we're not isolated or insulated and atomized individuals. We're always part of communities, and part of human fulfillment is flourishing in the community. There was one question in the chat box about institutions and how to respect the rights of LGBTI persons in institutions. The answer, of course, is to close institutions and to focus on the preconditions for flourishing in the community, regardless of human difference. And in terms of contribution of civil society and indeed governments, I think, and Victor, you probably agree, we're only beginning this journey. So one of the most important contributions is helping us with the framing of the issues. That's incredibly important. Second input would be information. We need the information that crosses the lines, that opens our eyes to the implications of the intersectionality, not just the existence of the intersectionality. And the third thing we need support with is maybe moral support in helping us build up the case for a deeper and a better intersectional approach, and why that's useful, not only to civil society in articulating grievances, but also to governments in plotting a way forward into the future. Thank you so much, Niluka. It's been wonderful to be involved.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Mr. Gerard Quinn, and also Mr. Victor, for those very important insights. And it's fantastic to know of your commitment to further the rights of persons with disabilities and those who are at the intersections of LGBTI and disabilities. So thank you for your work, and I wish you both the very best in this the fantastic endeavors that you have already kind of got underway. We're now going to move into a Q&A session. We're running a bit behind time, so we will have a brief session. I know many of you have brought up questions on the Q&A. I am going to turn to Po Kimani for the first question. Po, this is the question for you. We could speak about many different intersectional entry points, but I wanted to ask you about your experience with the access from young LGBT+ people with disabilities to human rights mechanisms and youth-friendly services. So basically the question on how do we enter this discussion on intersectionality from the perspective of young LGBT+ people.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, it's been very easy to be guided by, they have to be in the room. Young LGBTI people have to be speaking to us about what is happening in their lives. So like today, it will be work for us that the next session is guided by a young person who's self-identifying, who can guide us.
Sorry, Po, I'm sorry to disturb you. You've gone on mute. Can you unmute the mic, please?
Sorry, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm saying that that conversation about youthfulness and about being malleable and changing with the times is a conversation that we also need to recognize that young now in this world we live in has to include children in the room, has to include, when we think about a future that's speaking to our truth, that future has 8-year-olds being scientists and guiding our math programs. We have to open up to learn from everyone.
Great. Thank you so much for reminding us, you know, especially also not to leave the youth and children out of the conversation, children who are often underrepresented in these discussions. So thank you for that. Moving on to a question for Mr. Gerard Quinn. It says, speaking about technology, disabilities, and SRHR, what is your opinion on the technological developments that could support the agency and choice of people with disabilities regarding their sexuality? For example, initiatives that create sex toys specifically designed to be used independently by people with different disabilities. So yes, on the role of technology in this conversation, Mr. Gerard Quinn?
Wow, what a question. I must admit, the only time I've come across this is at a very interesting conference in China on assisted sexuality for people with disabilities. But this is an example of a topic that is not registering immediately, that I'd love to have input with your colleagues on, and I'll certainly take it on board. I do not have an immediate response. My separate concern is artificial intelligence and machine decision-making and the extent to which it can very subtly reprint and embed ableist and sexist assumptions, and the critical importance of tackling that. It's not an issue that's peculiar to disability, it's across the board, but I have to make a start somewhere. So I'd love to interact with you. This is a classic example of where we need more information to develop a perspective. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, actually. And I do hope that there will be further forays into this area post this discussion that we are having today. For one last question on, and this is to Victor, basically talking about how Colombia is going through a very unstable transit time, and in terms of the economic struggles and the issues that are faced by the country because of this violence in the population, and much more in the LGBT plus population with disabilities. Do you have figures of human rights violations that can summarize this panorama that LGBT plus persons with disabilities in Colombia face? So any particular information on human rights violations faced by LGBT plus persons with disabilities in Colombia?
Thank you very much. I don't believe that there is a particular knowledge stock that I can recall right now in relation to particular data that explores at this point of intersection. One of the challenges in the work that I carry out is precisely the absence of data that is disaggregated within intersectional analysis. And I'm going to answer in a general way that is applicable pretty much to every context, with the exception of very few exercises carried out by organizations that in fact are present in the room today. So I have access to a few reports that have looked at segmented data in particular contexts. But I am not aware of such data existing in many countries in Latin America at all. And of course, as I have mentioned in my report on data, this is one of the fundamental challenges that I think need to be faced in the future, is the obtention of such data to fundament good public policy.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, the need for disaggregated data, relevant, timely data, and also data and evidence-driven interventions is quite important. So I'm glad that that aspect was brought out through that question. In the interest of time, we will now move to the concluding section of this wonderful panel. I have loved moderating this panel, and I think we've got some excellent insights coming in through from all the different speakers. And just to actually reiterate what Mr. Gerard Quinn said, I think for me, what I heard from most of the speakers today is that this is about our personhood, our value, our dignity as persons with, living with different diverse circumstances and having different intersectional identities. It is about our human agency. It is about respect and dignity, and living in situations of safety, of not being marginalized or institutionalized or medicalized or pathologized and excluded on the basis of who we are. I really appreciate the conversations surrounding how colonialism and the neo-colonial framework also then impacts how we experience disability, especially for those of us who are disabled persons in the LGBTI community. I'm so glad that we started kind of scratching the surface today on the role of technology and artificial intelligence. And I'm glad that that topic is on the cards. And it's something that we do need further exploration, because as Mr. Gerard Quinn rightly mentioned, these technologies can duplicate, replicate, and even perpetuate ableism in ways that we have still not fully explored. We also spoke about the commitment that we need to make as a political commitment when it comes to sexuality and when it comes to the visibility of the issues we face. Most of us, and I'm coming from the perspective as a queer person from the global South, there's a great degree of invisibilization of who we are and what our needs are. And they're also, again, connected back to the pathologization and the criminalization that continues to exist in a lot of countries. Today we also look quite closely at the need to hear the voices, the different voices that make up this tapestry, this complex lived experience of what it is to be a person with a disability, or what it is to be a person who is LGBTIQ. So looking at the complexity of positionality is also something that was covered really well during this panel. And I think all of you, all the speakers were fantastic in that you really question this binary mode with which we operate, the way we view gender, sexuality, and disability, and how, when especially at this intersection of intersectionality, how the lived experiences of persons with disabilities who are also in the LGBTI community can disrupt those binary discourses and narratives that are existent in our societies. Dan made a very compelling argument for the visibility of intersex people, and also in terms of this whole idea of, what is medically necessary intervention, and how is our agency deprived through these normative frameworks of what it is to be a gendered person, or what it is to be a person with a health condition. We also looked at the impact of COVID-19 on persons who are LGBTIQ in the LGBTI community, and persons with disabilities, and where the intersections are in terms of access to health, access to information, and basically, being left out of the general COVID-19 response mechanism. I'm really grateful to the speakers who brought out that very valuable angle. We looked at bodies that are worthy, and communities of kindness and compassion, and how we need to really bring the heart element into our discussion of intersectionality. Thanks for bringing that aspect, which is really vital at the end of the day. We also looked at the need to explore hidden intersectionalities, in relation to, from where I'm coming from Sri Lanka, especially things like ethnicity, ethnic identity, and race, which gets left out of the equation. And also, Margarita mentioned, what kind of spaces do we create? When we talk about social justice, are our spaces accessible? Are our spaces inclusive and safe? So really looking widely and very broadly at the concept of, for me, at the end of the day, about our human dignity and our visibility, and our right to not just live, but as Gerard said, flourish as persons who are complex, who are intersectional, and who really add to the lived diversity of humanity. So thank you very much to all the panelists for their fantastic and for their insightful interventions today. I want to again thank the organizers of this event for bringing us all together in the spirit of inclusion and intersectionality. ILGA World, ILGA Oceania, OII Europe, CREA, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the permanent missions of Mexico and New Zealand. I am very grateful to the ambassadors from the respective permanent missions who spoke to us and welcomed us today to this event. I am also grateful to Mr. Michael Van Gerden, who is a co-host representing the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for also providing his perspective, especially in relation to COVID-19. I am thankful for the ILGA, CREA, and other key members who are present, who have done a lot of behind the scenes work to make this event possible and to make this event successful. I want to recognize the sign language interpreters, the closed captioners, and the other support staff who have really enabled us to have a very important conversation. And I really think this is just the starting point. There are so many strands here that we need to further pursue. And I hope that this event opens us opportunities for collaboration and have kind of inspired a lot of you to really very proactively take intersectionality into consideration. We are also very grateful to the Spanish language interpreters who have been on this call, as well as the Spanish closed captioners. So thank you, everybody. I hope this is the start of a much more extensive, not just conversation, but as most of the speakers said, how do we translate this discussion on intersectionality to the work that we ultimately do within our communities. And it has to happen at the level, not just of community, but also at the level of international advocacy. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful participation. And we hope that we will reconnect with each other in the future through similar events and platforms. Thank you.